Hello everybody, my name is Josef Hasslberger and I will present about the coherent structure analysis in turbulent natural convection. The work that I will present today is actually a collaboration between Bundeswehr University and Newcastle University in the UK. First of all, let me give you a little bit more of background. The configuration that we are studying here is usually referred to as Rayleigh-Bénard convection. And this kind of phenomenon is really relevant to many applications, not necessarily technical, and also relevant to many real-world scenarios. You can see two examples on the right. The first one is actually a cooking pot, and the second one is our sun. But the type of phenomenon incorporated is really the same, so it occurs on very different scales. And of course, there are non-dimensional numbers characterizing this problem. The most important one is maybe the Rayleigh number, but also the Prandtl number is quite important. Just as a reminder, the Prandtl number is the ratio of momentum diffusivity, so viscosity, to thermal diffusivity. And also in terms of the Prandtl number, there is a wide range of values relevant to these applications mentioned earlier. And there is also already a lot of research in the literature on the influence of the Prandtl number for this kind of phenomenon. For example, in terms of the boundary layer thickness or the ratio of the boundary thermal and viscous boundary layer thickness, but also like the spectrum related on the one hand to velocity fluctuations and on the other hand to temperature fluctuations. This depends a lot on the Prandtl number. Actually, for the high Prandtl numbers, you have an extended range with respect to the temperature fluctuations. But the contribution that we want to make here is the so-called flow topology analysis. And this is based on the analysis of the velocity gradient tensor. This is really an important quantity when it comes to the understanding or analysis of turbulent flows. Just to give you just to underline this, the velocity gradient tensor is also the number one input to turbulence models. In terms of the mathematical background, I should say that this classification of flow topologies is based on the invariance of the velocity gradient tensor, which can be split into a symmetric and anti-symmetric part. Luckily here, for incompressible flows, the first invariant is 0, which makes the thing much more easier. But then still we have the second invariant and the third invariant. And if you have a look at the mathematical definition here, you can also see that via the contraction of the rate of strain tensor, which is the dissipation of kinetic energy, this has a physical meaning as well, of course. And here we would have the contraction of the rate of strain, a rate of rotation tensor with itself, and that is like the entropy, which is something like the energy equivalent of the vorticity. Also, the third invariant has a meaning, and you can see that there are even higher order terms here. So that would be something like the production or destruction of dissipation and entropy and so on. But by combining these two scalar quantities, we can actually distinguish 4 different flow types. And there is also a mathematical criterion for these boundaries between the different flow types. And these are criteria are given by the discriminant of the characteristic equation. So what does it mean to have these 4 different flow types? You can see the mathematical terminology here, but maybe it's more intuitive to think about it in terms of either strain or vorticity dominated flow. These two are vorticity dominated, these 2 flow types are strain dominated, and this now can in addition be combined with distinguishing either a convergent or divergent flow behavior. So if you have a look at these blue streamlines, by the way, the blue circles here are supposed to indicate the origin of those streamlines. You can see that in these unstable topologies, the flow is like diverging, whereas it's converging in these 2 stable flow topologies. The vortex-dominated ones are the focal topologies. The strain-dominated ones are also called nodal topologies. And to generate the DNS database here, we have been using the open source CFD package, which implements the finite volume method. I think there is nothing really unusual here. We have conservation of mass and momentum, which just reduces to the incompressibility condition for incompressible flows. And maybe the only thing unusual here is the Boussinesq approximation. So I should explain that. It means that density variations due to temperature differences are only included via the buoyancy term in the momentum equation. So with respect to all the other terms, the density is as assumed to be constant. So the pressure is solved by the Pimple algorithm, which is optimized for transient problems. And also to have a preferably low numerical dissipation, we have centered differencing, second order for spatial discretization, and temporal discretization is achieved by the second order Crank-Nicholson scheme. So we have in the end, we have a consistent second order scheme here. Here is a sketch of the computational domain on the bottom right. So we have Dirichlet boundary conditions at the top cold wall and at the bottom hot wall. In addition, we have adiabatic sidewalls, and also in terms of the velocity, we have no slip condition everywhere. The non-dimensional numbers that we are studying here range from 10 to the 7 to 10 to the 9 in terms of the Rayleigh number, so viscous forces in relation to buoyancy forces. And I have already introduced the Prandtl number. By the way, the highest number that we are investigating here, 320, that corresponds to silicon oil at room temperature, so it is a liquid. In terms of the resolution, if you really want to make sure to resolve the smallest scales, you should make sure to resolve the smaller one, either the Kolmogorov or the Batchelor scale, but that can be really expensive, especially for high Prandtl number flows. As we can see here, the Batchelor scale is even smaller than the Kolmogorov scale. Actually, the spectrum is extended by the so-called viscous convective range. That can be really expensive. But we made sure to satisfy the relaxed resolution criteria by Grötzbach and by Shishkina. So in the end, it always depends on what you want to study. If you want to study only global characteristics like the Nusselt number, it's sufficient to have a lower resolution. But if you want to study statistics of higher order moments, of fluctuations, okay, then you need a higher resolution. It depends on what you're looking at. But now let's have a first look at the simulation results. What you can see here is, for one Rayleigh, two different Prandtl cases. Top row, unity Prandtl number, bottom row, the high Prandtl number. And on the left, you can see here slices of the temperature field, and you can see slices of two components of the velocity field. And again, what I just said about the spectrum, you can also see here. Since in these high Prandtl cases, the momentum diffusivity is clearly higher, the sharpness of the gradients or the size of the structures is clearly larger here in the velocity field than in the temperature field. Whereas it looks very similar for the unity Prandtl case, which makes sense because also the spectra will be similar according to theory. But now there is another interesting difference between these two cases. Actually, the high Prandtl number case, we have a prominent feature here, which are these hot and cold plumes emanating from the active walls. We don't have that here in such a pronounced way for the unity Prandtl case. There we have more like a global circulation overlaid by let's say turbulent fluctuations. So this is really an important difference, which will also have consequences on the analysis presented later. But now let's really have a look at those invariants of the velocity gradient tensor, the second invariant Q and the third invariant R. And if we combine them in the sense of a joint PDF, we can make interesting observations. In addition to the Prandtl number here, we also distinguish on the left only samples from the bulk of the flow, and on the right only samples in the vicinity of the walls. And in 3 of these 4 cases, we can see more or less the behavior that you would expect from standard Navier-Stokes dynamics in homogeneous isotropic turbulence, let's say. So this is called the typical teardrop shape. But the behavior is clearly different in this one case where we have a high Prandtl number and when we only have a look at samples in the vicinity of the wall. So that tail of the teardrop, it clearly flips from the S2 quadrant to the S3 quadrant. And this is something that is maybe surprising at first glance, but we will try to find out where this is coming from. Since we have already calculated the 2 invariants, we can also now do the flow classification, and these again are slices through the whole field of the flow topologies. And from that we also get an impression about the size of the structures. I think we can clearly see that it is neither the Rayleigh nor the Prandtl number alone determining the size of the structures. It's actually the Groshoff number. And that also makes sense because the Groshoff number is what would be comparable to isothermal flows, comparable to what is the Reynolds number for isothermal flows. So we can see here that the smallest structures we have for the highest Groshoff number, for the lowest Groshoff number we have the largest structures. And these 2 cases are actually comparable in at least same order of magnitude in terms of the Groshoff number, and also I would say at least in the bulk the size of the structures is comparable. But there is also another interesting observation. Please have a look at this case here. The structures close to the wall, active walls, are clearly smaller than in the bulk flow. And this is also reflected in some of the resolution criteria from the literature. So again, if you just want to study Nusselt numbers, you might have different requirements in resolving the structures than for other kinds of analysis. Now let's have a look at this in a more quantitative way. What you can see here is like volume fractions of those 4 different flow types, averaged in both horizontal directions. So what we can see here, this is the vertical direction. So let's say 0 would be the hot wall and 1 would be the cold wall. And there is, I would say, 3 or even more interesting observations here. The first one is that the nodal topologies are clearly increasing close to the active walls, of course, at the cost of the focal topologies. So the flow close to the wall is clearly strain dominated, not vortex dominated. Another thing is that when we study the highest Groshoff number case with the strongest turbulence, let's say, then the distribution of those flow topologies is in agreement with what you would have in standard homogeneous isotropic turbulence. But finally, I would also like to mention that if the turbulence is not strong enough, then the distribution of flow topologies in the bulk is close to a pseudo-analytical solution that we have derived earlier. About 40% focal topologies and 10% nodal topologies. Okay, then the final question now to be answered is, where is this strange flip of the tail of the teardrop shape coming from? And actually, when we try to identify only those samples with a large negative R and large negative Q combined, then we can see that this happens exactly at the edges or at the junctions of the edges of convection cells. You could also say that these are mushroom-shaped plumes in contrast to sheet-like plumes, which you also have. But this topology S3, this really occurs predominantly at those junctions, at the mushroom-shaped plumes. And of course, we have already seen that this occurs mainly for the high Prandtl number case. In the low Prandtl number case, those convection cells are by far not that clearly defined as in the high Prandtl number case. So this is exactly where these S3 topologies, and therefore where the tail switching is coming from. Okay, I don't want to repeat all the points again, just one comment at the end. You have to be careful when you want to take established modeling strategies from low Prandtl number flows, let's say gaseous fluids, to liquid fluids, where you can have much higher Prandtl numbers. I think that is something that we can have here as a takeaway message. Finally, I also want to mention publications that have in a major way benefited from the SuperMUC project. The details of the analysis that I presented today, you can check them in the scientific reports paper, but there are also 2 other contributions I want to mention. The first one is about quantification of numerical dissipation on the fly during simulations. And in LES, that is actually very important, because there errors from modeling and errors from the numerics are usually on the same order of magnitude, and they can interact with each other, or they are influencing each other. And the second paper is also related to what I showed today. It's actually about velocity and temperature spectra in Rayleigh-Bénard convection. And since the temperature is not a passive scalar, like it is often treated in turbulent theory, but an active scalar, the spectra are affecting each other. I mean, it's an active scalar because it couples back also the temperature to the momentum equation via the buoyancy term. Okay, that's the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.